Second case study involves negative concord in English. So negative concord, we talked about this in the last lecture. This is saying things like, we don't need no education, or I never saw nobody. This is often called a double negative. So negative concord has existed in English for centuries. And there was an interesting study done using historical materials surveying the use of negative concord across the history of English. This linguist, she looked at letters written by men. So this goes back to long before we had audio recordings. So the next closest representation of speech you could get would be people writing letters. So she looked at 3 time periods, 1520 to 1550, 1580 to 1610, and 1660 to 1680. So 3 samples that are clearly distinct in time. She also identified 3 different classes among the letter writers. So there were the non-gentry, which was the lowest class, the gentry was the highest class, and then the middle ranks. These are people who weren't the gentry, but they were upwardly mobile, meaning they were people who were kind of aspiring to improve their social status. So here's a graph of her results. Right? So this is the percentage of negative concord. So negative concord is a non-standard feature. So we've got 3 sets of bars here for the 3 different time periods. And then we've got, in each set, we've got 3 bars for the 3 classes. Right? So the green is the lowest class, the true blue is middle class, and the royal blue is the highest class. So look at what's being used. Well, there's 2 things going on here. Right? Time is a factor, which in other words is like speaker's age, and class is also a factor. So look at time. So if you look at the first group, the 1520, we see the most use of negative concord here. If you look at the third group of bars, the 1660, we've got the least use of negative concord, and then the middle is in the middle in terms of use. Right? So the later we get in time, the less the negative concord is being used. Or in other words, the younger someone is, the less negative concord is being used. But across all times, there's also an effective class. Right? So we look at the highest class, compare the lowest class and the highest class. Right? So in 1520, we've got the lowest class using negative concord 84% of the time, and the highest class using it only 49% of the time. If you go ahead to 1660, we've got the lowest class using it 20% of the time, and the highest class using it 4% of the time. So they're both using it much, much less, but we still have that asymmetry where the lower class is using it more and the higher class is using it less. But what's interesting here is the middle ranks. Right? So the middle ranks, they're using negative concord even less than the higher class is. Right? So the lower class uses it a lot, the highest class uses it less, the middle ranks use it even less. Okay? And that's constant across all 3 time periods. So what is it? What kind of effect is this? We have a name for this. Right? This is actually the crossover effect. Now, it doesn't look the same on the graph because it's a bar graph, not a line graph. But what we're seeing is that what the high class people are doing, the middle class people are doing even more. Right? So that is a classic crossover effect. Okay, third case study. This was a study done by Peter Trudgill, a well-known sociolinguist. He did the study in Norwich, which is a region in England. And the variable that Trudgill was looking at was, how do you pronounce words like tune, dune, and news? Okay? Do you pronounce them with a glide as tune, dune, news, or without a glide as tune, dune, and news? Okay, so in standard Southern British English, you would use the variant with a glide. So you would say news. However, in Norwich English, the local dialect, it was more normal to use the variant without a glide. So people there in Norwich would say news rather than news. So Trudgill did interviews with speakers from Norwich, and he asked them explicitly what they thought about those 2 variants, about news and news. So he asked them which was better. And the answer people gave was, oh, it's better to say tune or news, right? The variant with a glide, that's better. So that's the standard prestige Southern British English variant. Right? So people were aware of that, and they said that was better. Then he asked people, well, what do you use? What do you say? And people said, in general, people said, we say tune. We use the variant with a glide. Right? We use a standard prestige variant. Okay, so that was asking them how they talked. But then he also then went and did an analysis of their speech during the interviews to see what they actually used, and to see if that matches up with what they said they used. And what he found was that no, actually, what they usually said, they usually used the variant without a glide, like tune rather than tune, even though they claimed to use the variant with a glide. So what's interesting here is there's a mismatch, right? So people's overt orientation was towards the prestige variant, the variant with the glide. Right? They said they think it's better to say tune rather than tune, and they actually think that that's what they say. Right? They self-reported as saying tune rather than tune. So that's their overt orientation. But what they actually use more often is the local variant tune without the glide, which is not the prestige variant, but they use it anyway. So, what's the reason for this mismatch? Think back to our discussion of social factors. If the local variant is considered not good, and people explicitly think it's not good, why would they use it anyway? Well, what Treadgill suggested was the local variant has covert prestige. Right? It isn't considered the prestige variant, but by using it, it shows that you're part of the local community. Right? So this goes back to the idea of identity. Right? People in Norwich say tune rather than tune, not because it's really formally prestigious to say tune, but because if you say tune, that shows that you're part of the community. Okay, next case study is on the same variable. So Sandra Clark, a Canadian sociolinguist, looked at the same variable in Canada that Peter Treadgill did in Norwich. In particular, Clark focused on one word, the word news or news. Okay, so with the glide news or without a glide news. Her paper was called News or News, the Complex Construction of Canadian Identity. So some context. So, social judgments of a variable sometimes are pretty clear in that one variant is considered good and the other is considered bad. So if you think about negation in English, there's a pretty clear social judgment that we don't need any education. That's the good way to say it. We don't need no education with negative concord. That's the bad way to say it. Right? Most people are aware of this judgment, and it's kind of black and white, and that's just it. However, there are times when it's more complicated than this. So there are times when a variant is good or bad, not just kind of as an inherent judgment, but depending on the speaker or depending on the situation. And Sandra Clark showed that this is actually the case for news or news in Canada. So first, some historical context. So the older form here is news, so with a glide. And if Canadians have any association at all for this form, they would associate it with British English, because it sounds kind of old-fashioned. So if you think about British English, if there are sort of British connotations to saying news, what are the positive associations that would come with that? Well, if we think of British English as being traditional, as being kind of cultured, as being well-spoken, right? These are associations that go along with Britishness. There are also negative associations that go along with Britishness, that it's considered kind of old-fashioned and maybe snobbish, right, to speak with a British accent. So there's both positive and negative. The variant that doesn't have a glide, news, this is a newer variant. And if Canadians have any association, they would associate it more with sounding like Americans than sounding like British people. And again, there are both positive and negative connotations that come along with that. So what's good about, what do Canadians consider to be good about American English or American society in general? Well, there's these connotations of modernness, innovation, right? America has been the source of many inventions and so on, and also kind of a down-to-earthness that's associated. Compare Americans and British people, right? Most people would say Americans are more down-to-earth than British people. Not that that's necessarily true or not, but it's sort of a stereotype that we have. What about negative associations? Well, Canada has a bit of a hang-up in that America is our neighbor, and we don't want to be like America, so it's sort of negative to be considered American if you're a Canadian. So, again, we have positive and negative. So then if you're going to choose to say news or news, now of course you don't think about it consciously, but subconsciously it kind of depends on, not just on do I want to use a good variant or a bad variant, but what exactly is my persona? What do I want to project about myself? Or what kind of context am I in? So some of the findings that Sandra Clark made. So looking at Ontario, she saw that over time there has been a continual decline in the use of news. So people born in the 20s and 30s used news the majority of time. People born around 1960, they used news around 19%. The rest of the time they said news. People born in the 70s used news 9% of the time. Okay, so going down and down and down. And what that means nowadays, most people in Ontario say news, not news. If we think about this in terms of associations, this would suggest that over time, the more American-like associations, like being modern, innovative, down to earth, they've been getting more important to Ontario speakers than the British-like associations, like sounding traditional and sounding cultured and sounding well-spoken. Okay, so if in Ontario nowadays most people say news rather than news, does that mean that news is now the prestige variant? Right? We might think that if most people say it, it should be prestigious. So normally, yeah, that would be the answer would be yes. But actually, in this case, it's not so clear. So what Clark found was that if you did an experiment to get someone's really careful speech, so if you got them to read word lists, for example, there suddenly they would come out with news. Even people who normally say news might start to say news in their most careful speech. And if news wasn't the prestige variant, that shouldn't happen. So it seems like news still is the prestige variant, even though people don't use it anymore. Okay? But what it's become this very specialized variant that you can use to show that you're speaking extremely carefully, extremely formally. Another interesting aspect of Clark's study was that she gathered data from Canadian television. Okay, so as it so happens, the word news is spoken quite often on TV. Right? Welcome to the 10 o'clock news, and so on. So what Sandra Clark did was that every night she sat down and watched the news, and she just kept a tally of whether the news anchor said news or news. In particular, she kept track of two networks, CBC, which is our public broadcaster, and CTV, which is a private broadcaster. So it's a very interesting setup for a study. And she had a really interesting finding, which was that the people speaking on CBC had significantly higher use of the traditional variant, news, than CTV. So people on CBC were more likely to say news than news to a much higher degree than people on CTV. Can we think of a reason why that might be the case? So think about what the two variants signify. If news at a subconscious level signifies tradition, culture, Britishness, and news subconsciously signifies being modern, being innovative, being more American-like, is there a reason why people on CBC might be more inclined to use the more traditional variants, and people on CTV might be inclined to use the more modern, more innovative variant? I'm not going to give you an answer here, but I think you could imagine, right? I mean, the CBC, it's a public broadcaster. It kind of sees itself as the repository of Canadian culture. It compares itself to the BBC, right, the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is a sort of model for public broadcasting. So there could definitely be reasons why CBC people would tend to use more traditional, more British, more considered well-spoken variants than CTV people would. Okay, so very interesting results here. So what lessons do we take out of Clark's study? So it's not always as simple as, is this variant good or bad? Different variants can do different kinds of sociolinguistic work. Okay? And by sociolinguistic work, we mean they let you project particular qualities that you want to project, right, through your speech. So do I want to sound well-spoken, such as people on CBC saying news, or do I want to sound modern, such as people on CTV saying news? Or do I want to sound local? Excuse me. Do I want to sound local, such as people in Norwich saying news? So in choosing subconsciously to use one or the other of these variants, you're choosing to project particular qualities about yourself. So you're using these variants to do particular kinds of sociolinguistic work.